Chris Eubank Jr. versus Conor Benn. The fight is finally here this Saturday, April 26th, and we will do a live. Now, I believe their ring walk time is just before 10 p.m. in the UK, which translates to approximately 2 p.m. in the afternoon, Los Angeles time. So I will start a live probably about 1 p.m. Los Angeles time, so do tune in for that. There's been quite a bit of fuss about the bad blood between the Eubanks and the Benns, and plenty of rehashing of the rivalry between Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank Sr. has also been quite outspoken in calling this fight a disgrace. Now, I don't want to go into all the drama behind this rivalry because I don't feel that actually has an impact on what's going to happen in the ring necessarily. So let's just do a technical breakdown of this fight and ignore all the drama. Let's start with Chris Eubank Jr. He's 35-3 with 25 KOs, and he currently holds the IBO version of the middleweight belt at 160 pounds. Now, his losses have been versus decent fighters: George Groves, Billy Joe Saunders, and Liam Smith. Now, of course, Chris was able to return the favor to Liam Smith and knock him out in the return match. It's relevant to note that Chris Jr. did start out his professional career at the age of 22, so he's been in the pro ranks for 13 years, and he also started out at 168, super middleweight. But since 2019, that is for the past 6 years, Chris Jr. has been campaigning at 160. So this hullabaloo that his father's making about him having to boil down to make 160 might be a little bit of hyperbole. Conor Benn is 23-0 with 14 KOs. He turned professional at age 19 and has notable wins against Chris Algieri and Chris Van Herden. Conor Benn is 28 years old. Now, it is also important to note his weight because he campaigned for most of his career at 147 welterweight. So that's why there's so much hullabaloo about this weight difference between Conor Benn and Chris Eubank Jr. So quite a difference. It's two weight divisions difference between 147 and 160. However, since 2023, for 2 fights, Conor has been campaigning at 150 and then 154. And he did state back in 2023 that he did want to compete at 160. So let's give him the benefit of the doubt and assume that he's put that weight on responsibly over the past few years and built up quality muscle to move up from junior middle to middle. Let's compare these fighters technically. Now, it may come as a surprise, but when I started to break down Conor Benn and Chris Eubank Jr., I found that they actually have more in common than they do different. I'll start with Chris Eubank Jr. Let's take a look at what he does defensively and offensively. So defensively, he doesn't really have a strict guard position. In fact, Chris Eubank almost abandons a guard position because he keeps his lead hand quite low. Sometimes he just quite often Chris Eubank just lets that lead jab hand drape over his thigh. Most of the time he does keep his right hand up at about shoulder height. But I've yet to see Chris Eubank adopt a double high guard or even really a shell guard. There are some boxing trainers who advocate having their fighters keep that lead hand low because they feel that that allows them to be more relaxed and throw their punches from a very relaxed position. Eubank Jr. has okay footwork. It's not terrific, but it's passable. I would say he is flat-footed, and by that I mean that everything from his ankle from his ankle to his toes acts as if it's one solid piece. I jokingly say that fighters that move around like that act as if they have hooves and not feet because they never bend their foot like you would if you were doing a lot of jump rope. Nevertheless, I appreciate that Eubank Jr. does not cross his feet. They are a little bit wide for my liking, but Chris is able to move around the ring decently, so his footwork works for him. In terms of head and torso movement, not a fan, Chris Eubank Jr. He has his hands low again, and he will lean straight back to avoid punches. Eubank Jr. will also lean backwards and to his right to avoid punches, again with his hands down. Eubank Jr.'s torso movement reminds me a little bit of those inflatable things that they have at a lot of car dealerships, where it's like a big, huge plastic tube with a face painted on it, and they shoot blasts of air up this tube, so it's inflated and it's standing up, and then the air stops and this thing collapses and bends down, and then it shoots air in it and it pops back up. Well, that's the type of torso movement that Eubank Jr. used, and that's why he got caught with Liam Smith in their first meeting. Because Eubank Jr. put himself in the corner and then tried doing that flippy floppy torso motion, and there was nowhere to go because he was in the corner. So Liam Smith caught him with some hard shots in that corner, and that was the beginning of the end for Eubank Jr. in that first meetup. If Chris Eubank Jr. had the double high guard and bobbing and weaving as part of his defensive repertoire, he might have avoided that first KO to Smith. Chris Eubank Jr.'s offense is primarily dependent on his jab, and he does have a decent power jab. It's an interesting jab because it's what I call a pseudo up jab. By default of him having his lead hand drop so low by his thigh, of course he's going to have to bring his jab hand up in order to connect with either target of the body or the head. However, a true up jab is thrown from a further distance out, and typically the fighter will step in, take a hard step in with that up jab, and the objective is to strike the opponent underneath the chin with the top part of one's fist, not so much with the knuckles. Because what you want to do with that up jab is just tip their chin up in the air so you can come right behind that with and peg them with the right hand, as they say, down the pike. But that is not Chris Eubank Jr.'s objective when he throws his jab from his thigh level. He's simply trying to connect with that punch. And even though Chris Eubank Jr. does not take a big hard step in with that jab, it is a powerful single jab. To follow up, Chris Eubank Jr. will throw a bit of a slightly loopy right hand. And one thing I've noticed is that he does tend to do what I call celebrate the right hand. By that I mean after the right hand's thrown, instead of bringing it straight back in a straight line, back to the guard position by the chin, some fighters will kind of flip it up in the air like they're saying yay and kind of celebrating that they just threw or landed that right hand. In my opinion, again, a bit of a no-no. You don't want to celebrate your right hand. To his credit, however, Eubank Jr. has a great right uppercut. Sometimes he'll throw that as a lead punch, which is a little bit unconventional. What makes his uppercut even more unconventional is the fact that he'll throw a right uppercut and then a left uppercut. That's not really a typical combination, because most fighters will throw a right uppercut to a left hook or a left uppercut to a straight right hand, but not a right uppercut to a left uppercut, or vice versa, left uppercut to right uppercut. However, Eubank Jr. is able to do this, and he's able to pull it off. Now, my main concerns for Chris Eubank Jr. Versus Conor Benn involve his odd defensive skills, particularly the fact that he tends to move his torso around with his hands down at his thighs. My second concern for him is that he mainly throws single punches. They are power shots, but he doesn't always put his combinations together. When he does do that, he's incredibly effective, as he was versus Liam Smith in the rematch. But it's not clear to me why he doesn't do this all the time. But finally, my greatest concern for Chris Eubank Jr. is not so much technical as it is his mindset. Here's what I'm unclear about. He's one of those fighters who changes trainers, as the cliche goes, changes his trainer as often as he changes his underwear. I believe he started out with trainers in the UK, then he decided to switch to Roy Jones Jr., Then he decided to switch to Bomac, and then he switched to Jonathan Banks. Now, the positive note is that Eubank Jr. does have several wins with Jonathan Banks in his corner. And I have a great deal of respect for Jonathan Banks, both as a fighter and as a trainer. I don't know if you guys remember Jonathan Banks fighting as a heavyweight. I remember seeing him fight live at Madison Square Garden. I think it might have been his last fight, but he did perform well, I thought. And at the same time, he was charged with training with Klitschko's because he kind of taken over for Emmanuel Stewart. So as a trainer, Jonathan Banks comes from a very schooled background, working, training and then working at Kronk as a fighter and then as a trainer. What I like about what Jonathan Banks' approach seems to be, as he said on camera to Chris Eubank Jr., he said, I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to try to change the fact that you want to throw those uppercuts. I'm just going to try to add to it, he said, because I can see that those are punches that you want to throw. It's kind of a tactful way of saying, hey, that's maybe not my choice of punches for you to throw, those uppercuts, but seeing as you're going to do it anyways, I'm going to work with that and try to come up with combinations that will complement what you're going to do anyways. There's no point in me trying to teach that out of you. Let's look at what Conor Benn does well. So in terms of defense, he, just like Eubank Jr., he doesn't really have a guard position. He does, most of the time, he holds his hands up at shoulder height and a little bit wide. Now, just like Eubank Jr., sometimes he drops that lead hand. Conor does not drop it as low as Chris drops it, but it is carried low. Now, in terms of variation, every now and again, he'll bring that up and do a high lead hand guard and cover the side of his head with his forearm. And then maybe 1% of the time, he'll adopt a double high guard for an instant or two. But most of the time, Conor Benn's guard is just his hands held at his shoulder height. In terms of footwork, Conor Benn too is flat-footed, just like Chris Eubank. The only difference is, I think Conor's able to do those little shuffle steps, so his feet move a little bit faster, I think, than Chris Eubank Jr. The biggest difference defensive-wise between Conor Benn and Chris Eubank Jr. is how Conor Benn moves his torso and his head. It's really quite skillful. Conor's able to slip to both his right side and his left side. That means to the outside and the inside versus a right-handed fighter, which is Chris Eubank Jr. Whereas Chris Eubank Jr. always seems to turn away to his right side, Conor is able to bob to his right. He's also able to bob to his left, which is a little more technically difficult righty versus righty. Conor is also quite coordinated and athletic, and he's also able to do little weaves underneath wide punches. He's able to do it single weave to one side or the other side, and he's also able to do the double weave one side and then the other side immediately. I give Conor a lot of credit with both his slips and his bobs and weaves because he does them with exactly the right timing. They're nice and tight, so he doesn't give away position when he does these defensive moves. In terms of offense, again, Conor has a few similarities with Chris Eubank Jr. For example, since he's carrying that jab hand low, his jab tends to be more of an up jab. However, in Conor's case, because he's the smaller fighter, he does tend to step in more with that up jab. But what I really like about Conor's jab is that he uses a lot of feinting, a lot of rhythm changes with his head and his body, making little stutter motions to try to feint his opponent out. That's exactly what a smaller fighter needs to do versus a bigger adversary, because you must keep that other person guessing as to when you're actually going to attack, so they can't set to counter you especially when they have the height and reach advantage. Now, a third habit that Conor has that's similar to Chris Eubank Jr. is he celebrates that right hand when he throws it. Sometimes Conor's right hand is a little bit loopy, and then he brings it back up a little bit loopy. But to his credit, probably one of Conor's most effective punches is his overhand right. Now that's going to be a key weapon versus Chris Eubank Jr., particularly because in this case he's giving away that much height and reach. Now the biggest asset I feel that Conor Benn has over Chris Eubank Jr. is the fact that he puts his offense right behind his defense. So in other words, he'll make a little bob or a little slip and he'll come right back immediately with a punch. Whether it's a slip to the right followed by a body shot, right hand, left hook, or a weave under, right hand, left hook, right hand, Conor's able to make a defensive move and come right back with a combination. And that's going to be a huge factor in this fight. It's going to be a huge necessity in this fight versus the much bigger Chris Eubank. Now, how do I see Chris Eubank Jr. and Conor Benn matching up? Well, let's start with Conor Benn. I think he's going to absolutely have to come in the best conditioning ever. He should know that as a smaller man, he's going to have to put up a relentless pace, and he's going to probably have to eat a few in order to deliver even more. Conor's going to have to make use of those feinting motions in order to get inside and land shots, preferably to the body, early on in the fight. If Conor can get to the body early, that will start to wear Eubank down. It will pay dividends, as we say, as the fight goes on. Those early body shots by Conor Benn landing on Chris Eubank's midsection will also help Conor Benn set up his overhand right. I feel it would be a big mistake for Conor Benn to try to land that overhand right too early, because he'll give Chris Eubank the opportunity to get a read on it and time it and just do his little lean back thing and have that work. So Conor Benn needs to refrain from getting too excited early on and too agitated to try to take Eubank out right away with his big overhand right. He needs to be patient, go to the body, set up that overhand right. On the other hand, Chris Eubank Jr., he's the bigger man. As his trainer told him, you don't need to go to him. You don't need to go after Conor Benn, because Conor Benn has to come to you, which is absolutely the case when you have a much smaller fighter facing a larger fighter. The smaller person must make the fight, as we say. So it sounds like Jonathan Banks' game plan for Chris Eubank Jr. is for him to just hold his ground, let Conor Benn come to him, and then make small adjustments, small angle shifts, and land his hard power shots. My one sort of word of warning with this is to not wait on Conor Benn too much. Chris Eubank can't get into this, fall into the trap trying to wait to land the perfect punch. He also has to set Conor Benn up and entice Conor Benn to throw a punch that he wants to then counter as Conor Benn's coming in. This is where the intellectual aspect of the boxing game comes into play. Hopefully Chris Eubank Jr. can also keep his emotions in check enough to be able to set up Conor Benn as Conor Benn's coming forward. So who will prevail in the matchup between Chris Eubank Jr. and Conor Benn? Well, at first glance, I would normally just say, hey, the bigger man, given that they're both on about the same level, the bigger man should prevail. I don't think that Conor Benn and Chris Eubank Jr. are that far apart skill-wise, even though Eubank Jr. has far more fights professionally than Conor Benn does. In fact, in terms of skill level, I would give the advantage to Conor Benn because he has superior defensive skills. And in the end, the key is to not get hit. So I'm going to give the edge to the smaller man in this case, Conor Benn. I say Conor Benn will prevail provided that he's in tip-top shape and that he put that extra weight on responsibly. The other condition is that he needs to have put that weight on responsibly without ignoring his responsibilities in the ring. Meaning, I sure as heck hope that Conor Benn put in a lot of really hard sparring rounds in order to prepare himself for this much bigger opponent. Well, no matter how this fight plays out, let's hope that we get a good referee in the ring. I sure hope we don't have that same guy who did a couple of what I thought were somewhat early stoppages this weekend, particularly that ref who stopped the Ben Whitaker-Liam Cameron rematch. Stopped it in what? He stopped it way too early. And then I don't think it was the referee so much as it was the doctor who stopped Sam Eggington versus Lee Cutler, but that too was a sort of odd stoppage. So after all this buildup and all this hype, I really, really hope that whoever the commission chooses to referee this fight, they choose a good referee who will let the action play out in the ring, and we, the boxing fans, will be entertained. So please remember to tune in for our live this weekend at about 2 p.m. or 1 or 2 p.m. Saturday, 1 or 2 p.m. Pacific time. It'll be evening in the UK. If you haven't done so already, please do hit the like, the subscribe, and the bell so you know when we are online and when we post our next video. Thank you so much for listening.